Hello, can you
Привіт
hear us?
вам. Так, приємно. Ви бачите, що я пізно.
Ура!
Я тільки скінчив читання курс
А,
української історії України.
ух
І
ти.
багато студентів, на превеликий жаль для мене.
А скільки, до речі, в групі?
Так, тепер уявіть собі 50. Не може бути
Ого!
більше як 50. І повний є. І в другому курсі також 50 плюс 17, котрі
Ого!
вони вишмарили, бо вони не могли прийти на курс. Це значить, можу сказати, що історія України дуже добре представлена тут. Майже більше студентів в одному класі, як цілий славістичний факультет має в всіх їх.
Чудово. От на
Ну,
цій ноті ми починаємо
так,
зараз
прошу.
нашу
Так.
бесіду. Друзі, значить, перед вами, без перебільшення, можна сказати, один з видатних науковців сучасності. І я би так сказав, що, крім того, що він автор 40 монографій, книг і величезної кількості буквально сотень тисяч там статей, таке інше, він вміщує в собі рідкісний такий дар. Він з одного боку історик, науковець, з іншого картограф. І ми всі знаємо, що без добрих мап будь-який підручник, будь-яка монографія, вона недосконала є. Боб сам робить ці карти, мапи. Він і одна з найбільш відомих робот це Атлас картографічний Європи, де розписано на декілька століть різні країни, як вони змінилися, кордони і таке інше. Ну і сьогодні говорили про те, як в Україні з'явилися перші підручники, умовно кажучи, це не підручники, а монографії, по яких почали діти навчатися. Говорили, згадували про Субтельного і його книжку. Але майже однаково Субтельним свою монографію підготував у цей період і Боб Магочі, Роберт Магочі. Ось оця відома книжка 96-го року «Україна. Історія». Ось вона, яка, я так думаю, і сьогодні не втратила свої цінності. І це один з найбільш, скажімо, відомих, умовно називаємо так, підручників, за яким навчаються західні англомовні переважно студенти. І я дуже багато міг би розповідати про Магочі. Ми давно один одного знаємо і брали участь в спільних проєктах.
We could spend a long time speaking of Dr. Magocsi. We have known each other for quite a while, and I will ask three questions. I first ask one, you give your answer, and we continue.
Я буду. Добре. Тоді третє питання, яке буде, я відразу зараз про нього скажу. Ну, не для тебе, а для аудиторії.
I will start from my last question. For the audience, I will give someone this book, Ukrainian Redux, which is a book that has recently been made for the Tribunal of Hague. And on behalf of Ukraine, it will be represented at the International Court because Russia has prepared its own big work in which it is promoting the idea that Ukraine does not exist. And in The Hague, the lawyers were looking for Western historians who would be able to write his response or her response, presenting Ukraine the way it is. And Bob Magocsi was recognized as such an historian. So in the end, I will be asking him to tell us about this work. So let's start from this huge book that we have shown here, Ukraine History. Later, there was also Ukraine History of Territories and Nations, illustrated History of Ukraine. So there was a full set. And it's a book published in 92, but it was prepared before. So where does the idea come from? And what was the purpose of it?
Да, у нас є перекладач, і можна
we
відповідати
also have simultaneous interpretation. You can answer in English, but I have to speak Ukrainian because, well, that's how it is arranged technically, but you can answer in English. So we have simultaneous interpretation here. So, the previous presentation we had here was on Hrushevsky. So to which extent were you relying on his concept when creating your book? And to which extent is your book different from what Subtelny would say? And the last question we have, if you could change anything in the book now, would you change anything? Would you redo anything? Or do you still believe it should remain the way it is? So these are my questions.
Так, дякую, бо я від самого початку думав, що я буду розмовляти англійською, і тепер ви мені дав відповідь на це питання, це, знаєте, це в порядку. You have now given me not one, not two, but three questions. And I'll start with the ones that I remember in the order that you gave them. And if I forget, then you will remind me of the question that you wish to have. First, just some bibliographic utochenia. That is, the first edition of this history, the history, put it this way, was conceived in the 1980s, then finally published in 1996 in the first edition. And that first edition appeared in English under the title History of Ukraine. And it was translated into Ukrainian and published by Kritika a few years later. But more important is a second edition of this history, which appeared first in 2010 and significantly different from the first edition, including in terms of how one describes periodization in Ukrainian history. And that new edition was entitled History of Ukraine, the Land and Its Peoples. 3 new chapters, bibliographical essay, obviously completely redone. And that one was also translated and published in Ukrainian in 2012, and I think it was called Ukraina Historia Zemel Tayi Narodів. So when I'm speaking here, I am referring really to the second expanded edition, which brought changes after the experience of the first edition. So now, in answer, and I guess let me pause my simultaneous translator if I am speaking too fast or if I need to take a pause between my thoughts for him or her to translate. Is the simultaneous translator happy with what he or she is doing now?
Встигаємо нормально.
Okay, fine, добре. Okay, so I will continue in this manner. So what was the idea behind writing this history, and combined with how is it different, if it is different, from previous general histories of Ukraine that were published before mine, and I might say, even those that have been published subsequently, whether they are by Plochy or by Wilson, or most recently by Hrystia. My history definitely differs and continues to differ substantially. In what regard? And I believe this is exceedingly important for educators and those who are working on restructuring curriculum for the teaching of history in Ukraine, and what its approach can be or should be. So what makes the history that I have written, and what drove me to do what I did, starting with the conceptualization in the 1980s, the first edition in 1996, and then the revised and expanded edition in 2010. Well, the first thing is that, as I like to joke, and as I say in the introduction, that my history of Ukraine, the land and its peoples, is the first history of Ukraine. Now, am I being presumptuous here? Were there not histories of Ukraine before me, general histories of Ukraine, whether it's Hrushevsky or Doroshenko or Trepiakevich, and then in later time, Polyanska, Vasilenko, etc., Isabtelny? Were there histories before mine and histories after? Yes. All of those histories are histories of the Ukrainian people, or the histories of ethnic Ukrainians. They're not the history of Ukraine. Ukraine is a territory. It is a very clearly defined state. And all previous histories, general approaches to put an emphasis on the evolution of the ethnic Ukrainian peoples. Fine as a subject, no problem. But that's not the history of Ukraine. History of Ukraine, let's say the territorial approach, requires multicultural, multinational attention. Because, as all of you well know, Ukraine has, the lands of present-day Ukraine have, since earliest recorded historical times and prehistorical times, been inhabited by a wide range of peoples, some of whom have come and gone, many in the early period, some of whom are still there after arriving in the 17th or 18th century, whether Russians or Poles or Bulgarians, Romanians, Crimean Tatars. We can go on and on and on. So any serious history of Ukraine, namely a state and a territory, must include a description and treatment of all of those other peoples. Now, you may say, well, of course, any history of Ukraine up to now talks a lot about Russians or Poles or Crimean Tatars or Ottomans or whatever. Yes, that's true, but almost always those peoples and those cultures are treated as the enemy and not given full attention in terms of what they contributed positively to the evolution of the history of Ukraine. And whether it's positive or negative, that's of course a subjective view. That really doesn't make a difference. If we're talking about and want to understand Ukraine in the past and Ukraine in the present, all of its peoples in the past and in the present need to be treated. They need to have a voice, so that if your students who may be of Polish background or Jewish background, etc., they should be able to see themselves within the context of the history of Ukraine. So that would be my response to your question of the conceptualization, how I got onto writing this, and the conceptualization and similarities or dissimilarities with other histories of the Ukraine. And I think your last question was, if I remember correctly, Vlad, is that if I were to do a third edition of this book, would I do anything different? Well, I guess I would say structurally, no, I wouldn't do anything different. It still needs to be the multinational approach to the history of Ukraine. Obviously, the first edition, it was easy for me. I decided to end it with the creation of Ukrainian independence in 1991. Second edition, 2010, I obviously had to add a chapter, but then I ended it, I believe, with the Maidan. Or maybe not. Yes, I think I ended it with the Maidan. Now, of course, 10 years more, several years have gone by, and a new world has taken place. So one probably would have to add one more chapter discussing recent developments. But the general conceptual structure would remain the same. By the way, I've already made some changes in other editions, because when the Ukrainian edition of the second edition appeared, we made some corrections. And then, by the way, there is a Polish edition that was published by Księgarnia Akademicka in Krakow. Beautiful, almost 1,000-page edition. And there again, corrections were made, additions, because there'll always be corrections made, etc. But the concept remains the same.
Дякую дуже. Я хочу продовжити цю тему і
Thank
наголосити,
you, and
що
let me continue. I will emphasize that Professor Magocsi is one of the most advanced specialists in the ethnic and national history, and he has a number of books on the subject, zooming in on ethnic and national issues of the Crimean Tatars, and I will also be asking about the Jewish Ukrainian book that is more up to date. Professor has a separate book on the sources of Ukrainian nationalism, and these ethnic issues that the professor is focusing on became the basis for the concept of the first book. So the book about the Jews and Ukrainians, it has two authors, Petrovsky Stern, which wrote the part about the Jews, and Professor Magocsi wrote about Ukrainians. So one of the critical remarks that I would have is that the book only discusses the positive things and how these nations have interacted in positive manner, enriching each other. And there is nothing about the negative things that indeed were happening, such as pogroms, etc. And I would like to hear from you. What was the concept behind this book, and why exactly this positive approach that was chosen this time?
I guess I would say, first of all, that particular volume was it was commissioned by an organization called the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. And one of the primary goals of that organization was to show, through an analysis of the historical past or a description of what transpired, that relations between these two peoples on the territory of Ukraine, ethnic Ukrainians and Jews, were not simply, as is normally and often depicted in accounts of the history of Ukraine or Jewish history of Jews in Central Europe, was not simply a tale of destruction and pogroms, etc. Now, to say that in this particular volume, that there is nothing, that there's only describing the positive moments, that there is nothing about pogroms and friction, it's just simply false. I mean, read the book. The book exists in English and Ukrainian, so there's no excuse for whether readers from Ukraine or in an English-speaking world can't understand, but there's numerous descriptions of all of the pogroms that occurred or anti-Jewish actions, which is not everything was a pogrom, whether the first instance of this that has often been beyond belief, that is during the Khmelnytsky era, during the Haidamak era, during the late 19th century, beginnings of pogroms in the southern part of the Russian Empire, including Ukraine and modern-day Moldova. Certainly a discussion of the serious pogroms in 1919 at the close of World War I, during the era, about the Holocaust. I mean, the volume is filled with all of this to suggest that this volume is just looking at the positive relations between Jews and Ukrainians is just simply false. I mean, just read the book and one will see. However, having said that, and what is made very clear in the beginning of the book is the following: that let us assume, let us not deal with first appearance of Jews way back in prehistoric times on the Crimean Peninsula during antique Greek times and Byzantine times. Let's forget that. Let's speak about when large numbers of Jews arrived from Central Europe, Ashkenazic Jews, beginning in the very, very late 1500s, but really the beginning of the 17th century, up until the present. Let's say that's about 450 years from, for all intents and purposes, 1600 until the present. And out of those 450 years, the number of years in which there was violence that occurred between, and let us put there, I wouldn't even say violence that occurred between ethnic Ukrainians and Jews, but rather a violence that was perpetuated against Jews on the territory of Ukraine, which I think would be a more precise description than the dichotomy, Jews and ethnic Ukrainians. But in any case, of course, Jews, like many other peoples on the territory of Ukraine, experience violence and destruction, not to say the least ethnic Ukrainians themselves, but just if we're talking about just about Jews and their stuff, the number of years during that 450-year period in which violence was perpetuated against Jews, 18, maybe 20, maximum. You can do the math. 1648, 1649, the late 18th century, the late 19th century, etc., those that I've mentioned. We're talking about 17, 18, 20 years maximum out of 450. And what is the story, however, that one knows about Jews on the territory of Ukraine? Forget the 430 years. They don't count. We're only interested in those periods of violence. That is what this book was trying to correct. That the vast majority of time, the status and the life of Jews on the territory of Ukraine was as positive or as normal as that of any other inhabitants on that territory. But that's usually forgotten. And we're only thinking, like yellow journalists, of the negative, violent periods. That's what this book was trying to correct, and I believe did correct, without whitewashing, without eliminating discussion of those 18 years of those pogroms, or whatever one wants to call them, as I've elaborated.
Дуже дякую. І останнє питання стосується Гааги. Мені здалося, коли я читав цю брошуру, що в певному плані це такий концентрований підхід до історії України, який викарбувався у тебе внаслідок усіх цих попередніх робіт. Тут є і державність, і національна ідентичність. Тут йдеться про мовні питання. Тут дуже багато цікавих аспектів, пов'язаних з націоналізмом. І мені здається, що ця книжка, така концентрована, концентрований концептуальний підхід тієї історії України, яку ти всі ці роки писав. Отже, питання. Як так сталося, що тебе все ж таки запросили писати це, і наскільки тобі важко було написати такий текст, бо, як на мене, отакі саме тексти, можливо, важче писати, ніж ті грубезні книги, які ти писав доти.
To respond just to pick up on your last part of your statement, I always like to tell my students and my colleagues the famous line that Pascal said to one of his friends. He wrote a letter to one of his friends and he said, "Excuse me for writing such a long letter, but I didn't have time." In other words, writing a lot is the easiest thing in the world. Writing in a concentrated form, the most difficult. This weekend, I had to give a testimonial for a colleague of mine, and I had to sum up in 3 or 4 minutes all of my views of this person. Well, it took me 2 weeks to think about how to write that. I remember when I was at Harvard, and Harvard Memorial Church at the time had one of the greatest preachers in the United States. And by the way, if you want to learn how to lecture, and if you want to learn how to speak concisely, go find a good Protestant church with a good preacher and just go every Sunday just to listen to the sermon, and you will learn how to present things concisely, without fluff, because it's easy to speak a lot, it's easy to write a lot, incredibly difficult. And I asked him, he gives a sermon, the sermon is 35 minutes. He says it takes him 2 days to write it. 2 entire days to write a lousy 35 minutes. Well, it's not a lousy 35 minutes because those 35 minutes are concentrated. So similarly, this piece thing, which we called Ukraina Redux, is not a history of Ukraine, as some people would say, or a brief history. It is a report with specific requests by the legal team representing Ukraine at the International Court of Justice. It was the second of two reports dealing with Ukraine's case against the Russian Federation for the territorial acquisition of Crimea, and most specifically, violation of human rights of Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians on the territory of Crimea. And the first report, the first expert report that I had to do was a 45-page text dealing specifically with the issue of Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians and how they've been discriminated against. And then that report, that first report, was submitted to the court. The Russian Federation had a year and a half to respond. And after a year and a half, they responded, and the Russian Federation engaged as their experts the entire Institute of Ethnography in Moscow, 4 authors. And if my report was 45 pages, their report, which was an analysis of mine, was literally 200 pages. And in those 200 pages, they were less questioning the factage of what I presented than the interpretation. Okay, and done very respectfully, but nonetheless, I got it all wrong, according to them. And then the legal team made a decision that we now need a second report from me in response specifically to the Russian expert report. And the Russian expert report was concerned about 2 matters, which shouldn't be surprising to any of you. One matter was Ukrainian state. What is this? This is just something that came into being in 1991. It's not a real state. It was just an administrative entity that was only created thanks to the mistakes of the Soviet Union in its early phases. This is not a real state. So that was the first criticism. And the second criticism was, well, what's a Ukrainian? I mean, most Ukrainians speak Russian. They may say that some may say that they're Ukrainian, but this is really an administrative term. This is not a real people. Okay, classic position of Russian intellectuals and politicians, as we well know. So I was asked to respond to those 2 very precise matters: the question of Ukrainian statehood and Ukrainian identity. And that's what this Ukraina Redux is, a slightly changed report, but it's basically the report that was submitted to The Hague. And to do that in a short report, again, that is the biggest challenge, because to write constructively and concisely and still get your point across without superfluous details is the most difficult thing. And so I remember, some of my colleagues had said, well, why didn't you mention this? Why didn't you mention that? This is not a history. This is a report meant for people, in this case, the 15 or 16 judges that sit in the International Court of Justice, who know next to nothing about Ukraine. And they don't have time to read gigantic 800-page tomes. They need it concentrated real quickly, very clear. Sometimes simplification has to be done, and certainly leaving out details. So that is the challenges of creating that. And one small footnote, you had mentioned from the very beginning that one of my activities, aside from history, by the way, it's also sociolinguistics, it's also history of art, which I do, but there's a different things, but it's certainly cartography. I make a lot of maps. Do you know the most difficult thing is when you make maps? Is what information you leave out. Do you know how much more information should be on any map? However, one has to make a decision from the very beginning that if you're communicating with somebody, you cannot overburden either a text or a visual thing like a map with too much information. Because if you have too much information, then you have no information. And that selection process of weeding out things is terribly challenging, terribly. But that is what should be done if one wants to be an effective communicator, as theoretically professors should be, but most of them aren't, but certainly teachers have to be. And by the way, I'm assuming that many of the people in this audience are teachers or working in education. In the context of what we're speaking about, and I have tried it, and I'm unsuccessful, to write school textbooks. That is really difficult because once again, you're dealing with an audience that is starting from zero with information. You have to be very selective and you cannot overburden them with too much. But yet, never forget the most important thing in conveying knowledge to a society is not through scholarly monographs like we do, or even large-scale synthetic histories like we do. Who reads that stuff? And if they read it, how much influence does it have? It's the school textbooks that are the crucial instrument for reaching large segments of the population and for forming whatever body of knowledge one would hope that students have. Very difficult task. I can't do it.
Дуже дякую. Ми точно вклалися в час, але чи будемо ми задавати питання, Люда? Як? Значить, тоді питання. Хто буде задавати питання? Будь ласка. Професор Магочи. Так, от Щупак хоче задати. Він рідко буває в Канаді, не бачить. Йому треба щось питати.
А він тут є, Ігор?
А он сидить, он.
Я вас не бачу.
Ж треба було їхати з Торонто в Київ, щоб тобі питання задавати.
Так бачите. Yes, Dr. Щупак, what would you like to ask?
Пане професоре, я радий бачити вас в доброму здоров'ї, доброму гуморі. І я хочу просто ще раз подякувати за те, що ви берете участь в українському підручнику творення і зараз. І ті карти, які колись ви мені передали з відомого того Atlas of Central Europe, вони і зараз є в підручнику, який накладом виданий більш 200 тисяч. І цими картами і про Балкани, і по Східній Європі користуються діти. І це кращі карти, які я бачив. Дякую вам дуже. Питання таке. А що після цього атласу? Які нові картографічні роботи ви готуєте?
Well, I think I guess I would answer it this way. Someone in terms of my career is spending an inordinate amount of time having to oversee the translations of my work. And when I say an inordinate amount of time, believe me, it is an inordinate amount of. So, for instance, I produced a much smaller atlas, beautiful product, by the way. The whole question of the quality in printing is another issue, but I produced a small atlas dealing with, it's actually called Karpatska Rus Historiczny Atlas. It came out in English, and then it came out in Slovak. Actually, I spent more time having to work with the Slovak cartographers and text than I did in producing the original thing. Right now, you've mentioned the Historical Atlas of Central Europe. It is being published in Turkish in Istanbul. Exceedingly important, I might add, for that part of the world, and certainly for Ukraine, since Turkey is an important element in the international scheme of things. So there is a Turkish translation. In fact, it's already in Pages. But I have to go over all of those maps. By the way, I did study Turkish once, so I know a little bit, but this has to do with layout, etc. So a large body of time is spent on reviewing translations and controlling them into various languages. So all 46 maps in the big history of Ukraine had to be put into Polish. By the way, my illustrated history of Ukraine, which hasn't been mentioned here, that is a shorter history of Ukraine, which was really a revised historical atlas of Ukraine, which I did way back in the 80s. So now we did one with text, a lot more text, with illustrations, etc. And that was published in Turkish. Beautiful, large format. But the amount of time doing that is really incredible. New stuff that I am doing in terms of the cartographic world is really maps that are needed to supplement other texts. So, for instance, literally what I'm just finishing right now are 5 maps that accompany a history of art. I finished a history of art of the Carpathian region, and in there, one needs several maps. So, large-scale atlases, am I undertaking? No. Individual maps, yes. And in fact, the other individual maps that I do, because I've been engaged by our colleagues in Israel to participate in their historical atlas of Galicia. They have actually a historical atlas of Galicia. And so I did the opening maps and text for them about Galicia and a book of Vienna. So large-scale atlases, I don't think at the moment, but individual maps and overseeing translations is what I'm preoccupied with.
У мене є питання. Можна? Вітання, професоре. Це Гриневич Людмила. І я хочу, по-перше, дуже подякувати за неймовірно чудову і цікаву доповідь. І в мене є питання. Мова піде про зображальні джерела і їх прочитання. Це для нас дуже важливо, тому що я певний час трошки попрацювала в комісії, яка аналізувала змістовне наповнення підручників з історії. І звернула увагу на те, що насправді в українському підручникотворенні є з цим велика проблема. Перше, зображальні джерела подекуди розглядаються просто як ілюстративні, прикраса до видання. По-друге, надзвичайно неохайно автори ставляться до атрибутики, тобто опис, джерело, назва, там, датування, оці всі питання, до них ставлення дуже таке легковажне. Між тим, ми дуже добре знаємо, що зображальні джерела – це те саме джерело, яке не розглядають, а яке читають. І у вас ваша ілюстративна історія і ваші книжки, книжка «Євреї і українці» – це надзвичайно ретельно відібрані зображальні джерела. І я би дуже вас просила, щоб ви прокоментували, наскільки, яка ваша методика, як ви ставитесь саме ось до цього типу історичних джерел, і що б ви порекомендували, по-перше, упорядникам підручників в цьому плані. А по-друге, тут у нас в залі є також і представники комісії, яка аналізує підручники. Тобто, на які речі звертати увагу, оцінюючи змістовне наповнення сучасних підручників. Дуже вам дякую.
Thank you, because when I was asked earlier on by Vladyslav Hrynevych regarding the concept behind the large history of Ukraine and its various editions, I did forget something very important, and that is, from the very beginning, I thought it was absolutely necessary that documents, actual texts of documents, and obviously had to be translated, but that be included not as a kind of illustration, but as an integral part of the narrative. So, for instance, if we're talking about the Ukrainian national revival in the 19th century Russian Empire, speaking about the role in the 1860s of the journal Osnova, this cardinal text by Kostomarov to Rus nationalities, preferably Rus nationalities, not to Russian nationalities, as it is usually translated to Rus nationalities. This had an important role. Well, we should have in the text, as I do, blocked out a significant portion of the words of Kostomarov himself. And right there in the text, not in the Krestomatia is a separate volume, or not even at the end of the Pidruchnik, but integrated, blocked out within the text. Similarly, I thought it was exceedingly important, and no one has used this, no one has done this until today, for my Polish colleagues are overjoyed, because difficult to believe, I have Polish colleagues amongst other places in Gdansk, who, when they teach the history of Ukraine, they assign the English language version of my history of Ukraine, not even the Polish language, even though it's the same. But be that as it may, 17th century, this whole question of Khmelnytsky and his successors, wanting to buy into a political system, wanting to be recognized within a political system. Well, they can't get into the Polish political system, and that's why then Khmelnytsky turns to the Tsar, but his successors, still try their luck to get into the Polish system. And we have the Hadziach, the Treaty of Hadziach. Spoken about, well, has anyone ever read it? Has anyone even found it? Well, we translated it fully. And this is absolutely fascinating, because this was a potential solution to Ukrainian political life, or Rus-Ukrainian political life in the 17th century. A solution that may have, if accepted, would have changed a lot in the subsequent development. But we should be able to read this text. So in that sense, I believe that, or I remember the 1930s, we talk about these trials. So I went and found the excerpts of the trial against Hrynko. We were talking about how terrible Ukrainian nationalists. Well, what actually transpired in those trials? What questions were asked? What were the responses? Again, should be close to one's own narrative, so that someone doesn't have to look far in the back of the book or in another book. So texts of documents, very important. Once again, however, it's a question of selection. Not only what documents, but then how much of them you can put in, because some of these documents are very long and you can't have too long. But they should be always included with text, and including in Pidruchnik, in textbooks, school textbooks.
Про зображальні джерела. Питання ще про роль зображальних джерел, ілюстрації в підручниках і наукових працях.
Is that a question? And are you talking about now illustrations in the terms of photos? I mean, what's the question here?
Фотографії, зображальні джерела, візуальні джерела, фото, живопис, плакати, карикатура. В наших підручниках дуже часто ставляться дуже легковажно до такого роду джерел, вважаючи їх просто ілюстраціями.
I see what you're saying. Okay,
питання.
I think I understand what you're saying. By the way, this is also the manner in which reputable scholars treat maps, and publishers follow suit. They don't treat them seriously. They can be added at the end. Maybe we'll have some, maybe we won't have some. Some of these texts have either terrible maps or no maps because they're not taken seriously. Because a map, and for that matter, an illustration, which you're talking about, is 1,000 words, right? Minimally. So, agreed in terms of school textbooks, aside from texts of documents, other kind of documents, several of which you have mentioned, have to be chosen very seriously, not haphazardly. They're not decorative items. They have to be chosen to the degree that they literally illustrate what is being said in the narrative. And let me tell you one thing. It's very difficult to do that. My illustrated history of Ukraine, I actually wrote it while I was sitting on taking a vacation. Well, I live every summer on the French Riviera. I'm sitting on my balcony, and I wrote the illustrated history of Ukraine in 4 weeks. Right? Set out a schedule, every day wrote it. It took me 4 weeks to write the whole text. Then the authors wanted, aside from the maps, which were already done because they just took them from the big history, illustrations. I'm not exaggerating. It took me 1 full year to pick the illustrations for a text that I wrote in 4 weeks. 1 full year. And after that 1 full year, I was like going crazy. Choosing illustrations, the right ones, is terrible. Time consuming. First of all, you can even have an idea of what you want. You thought you saw it somewhere, and then now go find it. And then when you find it, is it of sufficient quality? So we can go on and on and on. The point being, illustrations essential, and they have to be, the choosing of illustrations has to be considered a major intellectual investment in time and energy.
Пане професоре, добрий вечір. Олексій Сокирко, Київський університет Тараса Шевченка. Я маю таке питання стосовно ось цієї вашої книжки, яку нам сьогодні презентували, а точніше про її потенційну читацьку аудиторію. Ми чули, що вона написана була на замовлення Гаазького суду. От я хотів би спитати вас, якою є рамка сприйняття України, її історії, її сьогодення, але не у інтелектуалів, не у вчених і гуманітарів. Да? Ми
більш-менш маємо контакти, значить, зі своїми європейськими колегами в Канаді, ми це знаємо. Сприйняття не політиків, вони його озвучують через ЗМІ, ми теж це знаємо. А якою є рамка сприйняття, чи радше стереотипів сприйняття України у технократичних еліт, у суддів, у менеджерів великих транснаціональних компаній, тобто тих технократичних еліт, які є decision makers. Так? Ось це особисто для мене, я думаю, що для багатьох з нас знак питання великий. Чи могли ви прояснити, що в головах стосовно сприйняття України у цих людей? Дуже дякую.
Thank you very much for that question, because it is an important matter. I didn't realize that we were presenting today Ukraina Redux. I mean, you have it in your hands, that's nice, but I thought it was just a handout. But be that as it may, on that question, very important. That text, as I've already explained, was an expert report meant for only the International Court of Justice. It was a colleague of mine here in Canada who himself is always anxious and concerned about bringing Ukraine to the attention of civil servants and government leaders, in this particular case in his country, Canada. He said, listen, you know, this is a great short text. I would like to publish it. And I said to him, well, you know, this wasn't designed to be published, certainly not sold. And I'm not, I need another publication like I need a hole in the head. However, I said to him, you know, if you really want to do it, if you really think it's okay, and it's a good elaboration of Ukrainian matters for the contemporary world, I said to him the following. Publishing something like this, that's easy. What one needs to do is raise not only as much money as publishing, but twice more than we are going to pay to just publish it and print it for distribution. And distribution to whom? Very specifically, we came up with a list of 7 categories, beginning with representatives in the United Nations, parliamentarians of the leading states, Britain, France, Germany, Turkey, United States, Canada, Japan, Korea, and set out then, the argument is that we needed to get this into the hands of government officials. So that was that category. Then there were the category of opinion makers, you know, public intellectuals, the category of media, not to have it republished, but rather to get into the editorial offices and newsrooms of media people. So we spent an incredible amount of time having to identify this and then having to get it into people's hands. And in the end, this thing, in the English language version first, got into the hands of every member of Congress and Senate in the United States, every member of Parliament in Canada, every member of the House of Commons in Britain, select members of the House of Lords, all 800 members of the European Parliament, and all delegates, all ambassadorial delegates of the United Nations. So that was the initial wave for the English, and newsrooms, et cetera, et cetera. Then we figured, you can't imagine what the cost of this is. I mean, it's astronomical. Then we sort of said, well, we only have the English. Sending this to parliamentary members of the Bundestag and maybe to every federal parliament in Germany, very important, because this was at a time when Germany was wavering in its policy toward Ukraine, et cetera. Still, you know, this continual pro-Russian or sympathetic toward Russia. So we had to get the Ukrainian message to whom? To the people who make the decisions, in terms of approving budgets for foreign relations and so forth and so on. Well, we can't expect as much as Germans are supposed to know English. Do you think they really know English? They don't know English that well, and certainly not these guys that get elected to the Bundestag. Some of them do, but most of them don't, let alone the Italians or the French. Forget it. So then we started a process of translations. So this little publication exists in 9 translations. And then go find publishers to publish it. The German thing and the French thing took, I don't know how long, but as a concrete now answer to your question, finally found a German publisher called Ibidem in Hanover, who took this on. We paid them enough money because not only did they take it on, they, like the Japanese publisher, published it in Japanese, published it in German, and I'm using now only the German example, got it into the hands of every member of the Bundestag. And we know this because they put, the Germans were smart in this, they put a personalized letter in German, I guess from me. And so I got responses from several members of the Bundestag and ministers who actually not only got it, but read it. And I could tell by the way they thought, because this wasn't just, thank you very much for this nice book. No, page-long letter. We did this kind of information and so forth and so on. So this little item, which now we need to publish in Russian because our colleagues in Kyiv want it in Russian for good reasons. This little thing, this little tiny little publication has gotten around to more people than one would have ever expected. And the next version that's coming out, L'Armatan in Paris, is publishing the French version, and now we're trying to find funds so that it can get into the hands of every member of the Assemblée Nationale. So this is what we've done with this little thing. Its purpose is not for people who already know. Its purpose is for people who know nothing or next to nothing about Ukraine, and that they can, after reading this, and then with the maps in there, which are very important, because the first thing people, first thing people are going to do, and we know this, they pick it up and they look at the maps because it's illustrations. And then they suddenly see, oh, Ukrainian state, 17th century? Wow, well, what is this? How is this possible? We thought this country only came into being a couple of years ago, a couple of decades ago. So all of that, very important. It's part of our contribution to the information war.
Друзі, ще є бажання запитати? Добре. Боб, ми надзвичайно задоволені, надзвичайно тобі вдячні за це. It's a good beginning for our seminar, I think, to begin with you. І я думаю, що ми будемо ще в контакті. У нас будуть різні семінари, на яких, можливо, потрібно буде твою допомогу і твою пораду. Дякую дуже.
Я вам всім також дякую, тому що дуже тяжко вас бачити, але все-таки я бачу, що там сидять коло столу людей, і дуже приємно для мене було з вами зустрічати і мати можливість пояснити різних речей, це, що я зробив в останніх роках. Дуже вам дякую, всього найліпшого, з Богом.